That's good. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum. Benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostra. Amen.
Sancte Joseph,
Ora pro nobis.
Sancte Anselme,
Ora pro nobis.
Sancte Piedecime,
Ora pro nobis.
in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Okay, we continue this study of the revolution in the church. We left off on page 100. An invented scenario too implausible to be true. If the opinion expressed in Maxima Redemptionis, which was, what's Maxima Redemptionis?
The encyclical letter by Pope Pius XII.
Yes.
Changing the Holy Week service.
Yes. If the opinion expressed in Maxima Redemptionis were true, we would have been constantly hearing from our pastors or reading in the Catholic papers about a momentous dearth of support for the Holy Week services. But of course, there was no such situation. Good Friday has long been a widely held national holiday in most countries, and Maundy Thursday in several. As for Holy Saturday morning, it has been a long-standing custom that government offices and many businesses do not operate on Saturday, leaving many Catholics free to attend the morning Easter Vigil. In countries where it was customary for children to attend school on Saturday mornings, even in the unlikely event that this applied to Holy Saturday, it was within the remit of teachers in Catholic schools to accompany their charges to church services. While there would always be some people, no matter how the liturgy was arranged, who could not attend, most Catholics were free, or could arrange to be free to do so. So this is the pre-55 with the Holy Saturday ceremonies beginning at about 9 or 10 a.m. and ending at noon with the Easter Vigil Mass. But Bonini did not need arguments that could be proven, only those that could not easily be disproved by his opponents. His tactic was to present incomplete, out of context, and misleading information to the unsuspecting faithful who were in no position to judge its accuracy on a worldwide scale. They would have no means of identifying the mismatch between the assumption and the facts, even if the claim happened to be true, and its veracity is far from established. It by no means follows that changing the Holy Week liturgy would increase attendance. Up until 1955, there is ample reason to believe that the Holy Week services were well attended. Although few people are alive today to provide memories of the pre-55 ceremonies, there is an alternative source of information: contemporary newspaper coverage. Maxima Redemptionis disregarded the reality on the ground. Michael?
All we have to do is search the archives of various Catholic newspapers dating from the late 19th to the mid-20th century, or the Parth newsreels to provide a reality check. These attest to the fact that Catholics flock to the Holy Week services, including the Easter Vigil, in great numbers. Here are a few representative examples from the London area, which could be applied to the situation in various countries around the world. 1898, quote, "The services at Farm Street and at the Oratory were also followed by dense throngs. Never does there seem to have been greater fervor in the churches during Holy Week in London," end quote.
Footnote: the Church of the Immaculate Conception at Farm Street, Mayfair, in London, has been run by the Jesuits since its establishment in the 1840s. In pre-Vatican II times, it was famous for its phenomenal success in making many thousands of converts to the church. All right, 1917.
Quote, "The churches were crowded at all the Holy Week services until the dawn of the new Easter day,
That's the tablet, April 16th, 1898. 1919.
At all the services, the vast cathedral, Westminster, was filled with attentive and devout congregations, and great numbers of the faithful received Holy Communion on Maundy Thursday and Easter Sunday.
Yes, so that's Holy Week at Westminster Cathedral, the tablet, April 2nd, 1911. So who was Pope in 1911?
That was Pope Pius X.
Yes, and this is Westminster Cathedral. Remember it?
Yes.
I remember.
It's the white and red brick.
Yes.
Yeah, it is beautiful. 1920.
Mass of the Pre-Sanctified was celebrated on Good Friday in the presence of a congregation which filled the cathedral.
1920.
A commentary upon
Sterling.
a commentary upon the sterling Catholicity of the working classes of South London is the fact that they attended in large numbers the services of Holy Week and Easter.
1920 again.
At the Church of the English Martyrs, Streatham.
That's where the Requiem is printed.
On Good Friday, Dr. Terry's setting of the music was finally rendered by the voluntary choir, the conductor being Mr. Collis, the organist, formerly of Westminster Cathedral. There was a crowded congregation throughout the day.
So those are all newspaper clippings reporting what?
The large crowds of people coming to the Holy Week ceremony.
Yeah, and including Holy Saturday and Good Friday, right? Read on.
Even allowing for some exaggeration in media reports, none of these accounts comes anywhere near the description of almost deserted churches found in Maxima Redemptionis. Indeed, by one of those delicious ironies of which history is replete, Romano Guardini himself inadvertently revealed the nonsense in this claim. Having visited the Basilica of Monreale, Sicily, during Holy Week of 1929, he recorded how impressed he was that on Holy Thursday, quote, the ample space was crowded, end quote, and attendance at the Easter Vigil service filled, quote, almost every part of that great church, end quote. Indeed, there are Catholics today in their late 80s and 90s who have vivid memories of churches in their areas which drew large congregations for the Easter Vigil and other Holy Week services before the 1956 reforms. But most Catholics today have become so desensitized to liturgical change that few would agree that there was anything shocking in the idea that the traditional Easter Vigil was problematic. As for the faithful who were flocking in great numbers to their Holy Saturday services before 1956, they would have had no inkling of the scale of the reform about to burst upon them, and were blithely unaware that their much-loved Easter Vigil was being threatened with extinction.
Yeah, as I say frequently, my aunt from Belgium, she remembers as a girl the bells pealing loud throughout the whole cities and all through the cities of Belgium, which was very Catholic. And they lived only a bike ride away, 10, 15, 20 minutes from a big Norbertine monastery with over 200 monks. And they would take their bikes with their dad and go to Vespers sometimes and hear the chanting of Vespers and pray the Vespers and go to benediction. But she remembers that, the bells ringing on Holy Saturday at 12 noon, announcing what?
The end of the Lenten fast. The end of Lent.
And announcing what?
The resurrection.
Yeah, the resurrection of our Lord. Even though it's anticipated and it's the vigil, like I said, the vigil mass for Holy Saturday, there is none in the 55 changes. There's nothing going on all Holy Saturday. except tenebrae in seminaries, some parishes. Page 102, in the middle, irony heaped upon irony, ruin upon ruin. Anthony.
It was only in 1956, when Maxima Redemptionis came into force, that disaffection with the new Holy Week rite set in among many of the faithful, especially those who were most attached to the traditional ceremonies. We have the word of the well-known Catholic novelist and convert, Evelyn Waugh, that this was so. Speaking on behalf of the English faithful who shared his negative views, he stated, quote, "Many of the innovations which many of us find so obnoxious were introduced by Pius XII," end quote.
Evelyn Waugh, letter to the Catholic Herald, August 19th, 1964. So he wasn't happy. He was not happy with the changes, and I know many weren't, even in those days. Evelyn Waugh is the great literature writer, a Catholic out of England. He wrote Bride's Head Revisited. He wrote other works. So he wasn't happy with the new Holy Week. Go on.
The result of this disaffection was that as soon as the novelty wore off, attendance began to fall. Father John Coyne, rector of the seminary of Oscott in England, noted that, quote, "Now that the novelty is wearing off, parishes in many areas report dwindling congregations," end quote. And the Holy Week services are still playing to rapidly diminishing audiences in many areas, as churches continue to close through the shortage of priests and declining numbers of the faithful. Even worse, the administration of baptism, which was meant to be a high feature of the Easter Vigil, was plummeted to a level unprecedented in the history of the church.
Man, that's 1956. So, go on.
In January 1988, the Congregation for Divine Worship issued a circular letter which informs us that, quote, "the very concept of the vigil has almost come to be forgotten," end quote, and blames this amnesia on, quote, "the inadequate formation given to the clergy and the faithful," end quote. What more ironic indictment could there be of a key objective of the Holy Week reform, which was to increase attendance? Father, later Cardinal, Antonelli, who had been given chief responsibility for its implementation, had confidently explained in 1955 that the motives for the changes were, quote, "of a pastoral nature, that is, to bring the masses of the faithful back to the commemoration of the holiest mysteries of Christ's passion and death," end quote. What neither he nor the other Bugnini-bots on the commission realized was that the Holy Week reform, not being built on the solid rock of tradition, had all the stability of a house of cards. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that it was subject to imminent collapse.
Chapter 9, Intolerance towards Traditional Devotions. Pius X in Pascendi mentions that the scorn that the modernists have for devotions to the saints, devotions of the rosary, the scapular. And Pius XII also mentions it in Mediator Dei, how the liturgical wreckers and the modernists hate the devotions and get rid of them. So after Vatican II, many of the statues were just cleared out. We have 3 or 4 statues here that are beautiful, rescued from churches that got rid of them, that would have been thrown to the dump yard or antique shops. So, all right. An ineradicable sense of Catholic tradition. Gabriel?
When
Michael.
Bognini described the reaction of the bishops
Halfway.
to the Reformed Easter Vigil as a, quote, explosion of joy throughout the church, end quote, his jubilation was premature. The boast immediately backfired.
Louder.
From 1951 onwards, the reform ran up against an intractable problem. A sense of Catholic tradition among the majority of the faithful that could not be steamrolled out of existence. That would, for the majority of Catholics, take some time longer to achieve. By 1959, the American Augustinian writer, Father Dennis
Guinea.
Guini, commented glumly that, quote, the restored Easter Vigil meets with quiet but stubborn resistance, end quote. The people, in other words, were loath to give up their Holy Week traditions that had been an integral part of Catholic life for centuries. It has always been a key aim of the liturgical movement to eliminate any expression of legitimate popular piety, whether it took place during the liturgy, in the silence of interior prayer, or outside of it. Baudouin was the first to urge that Catholic devotions should undergo a process of quote-unquote sublimation, so as, quote, to have the Christian people all live the same supernatural life, to have them all nourished by the official worship of Holy Mother Church, end quote. In his opinion, only strictly liturgical rites were of any real value in the Church. From this erroneous notion, which was condemned by Pius XII, sprang another equally indefensible opinion, that the faithful only resorted to devotions because they were alienated from the true worship of the Church through lack of active participation. One of Baudouin's main biographers explained how Catholic devotions were regarded with antipathy by the members of the liturgical movement, who saw them as impediments to active participation.
Right. So an old lady who, let's just say her eyesight's poor, she can't read her missal anymore, she prays the rosary during Mass, she doesn't bother anybody, she's praying, God hears her prayers and her tears, and to a modernist priest, she's committing a crime against the active participation in the community. She's not participating actively. So the modernists hate the old devotions, lighting candles before the statues of the saints, etc. So an impediment to active participation. And another quote from Keith Pecklers, Father a Priest, S.J., The Unread Vision. The liturgical movement in the United States of America from 1926 to 55. Go ahead, this is the quote.
These popular devotions were religious exercises, often enacted in common, but separate from the Church's official liturgy. Over the centuries, as the liturgy was increasingly removed from the laity, these devotions grew in number and variety. Since they were often celebrated in the vernacular, they had an appeal which was lacking in a Mass celebrated in a language no one could understand. Further, if a church whose rituals had
In a church
whose rituals had become increasingly clericalized, popular devotions offered the possibility of an experience of prayer that was authentically of the people.
Yeah, so this priest here is just basically saying the old devotions, not everyone could follow the missal, follow the Latin prayers, but that's okay, they were praying. They were praying their novenas, their rosary, their devotions, and granted, for seminarians, that's not the best way to participate at Mass. The seminarians need to follow the missal. You need to know the missal inside out, cover to cover, and exactly where to go. Seminarians need to know this. If you're going to use the Roman Missal, you have to know the Missal well. But for the faithful, they have that freedom. They have that freedom, and they're praying. That's what God wants, is that they're praying. But all this active participation, how many are really praying? It's a good question. Read on.
The Reformers also
Denigrated
traditional devotions as a primitive hangover from supposedly superstitious pre-modern times, and rejected them as being
saccharine,
sentimental, and individualistic. But the underlying reason for the rejection was that they were an obstacle to ecumenism, the movement to conciliate Protestants who also rejected Catholic devotions, using the selfsame rationalizations as the liturgical reformers. That is why they have been doing everywhere in their power.
Everything.
Everything in their power to accelerate the collapse of pious customs and traditions which were dear to the Catholic faithful. If we wish to know the true worth of Catholic devotions and a full appreciation of their practice, we will have to consult the official documents of earlier centuries and the writings of Catholic leaders before the liturgical movement exerted its baneful influence in the Church. The contrast between the general attitude of the Church in the 19th and later 20th century could not be more distinct. Popes Pius IX and Leo XIII heartily encouraged popular devotions to the Sacred Heart, Our Lady, including pilgrimages to Marian shrines, and various saints by raising the status of their feasts, granting indulgences for their practice, and conferring blessings on their sodalities. For further confirmation of the positive light in which such devotions were held by church leaders, let us now turn to the 19th century prelate Cardinal Nicholas Wiseman, who was instrumental in restoring the Catholic hierarchy to England in 1850 after centuries of persecution and suppression.
Yes, so Cardinal Wiseman was right after 200 years of heavy persecution on the Catholic Church. He's one of those cardinals that, refurbished the Catholicism in England. Him and a number of others, which were very good cardinals. Abbot Ullathorne, and some various good names from that period of time. Benedictine monks, abbots, cardinals, bishops. There were some good ones. All right, and here's his quote. Read.
Quote, "Holy desires may grow, and what satisfied their yearnings in their weaker state may not be sufficient food for them in their strength. And we believe sincerely that the longing of our people after the higher spirit of devotion is, and has for some time been, on the increase. Devotions, formerly but little known in practice, are becoming, thank God, familiar to us, as to the rest of the Church. We may instance the Rosary, that favorite tribute of sympathy to God's Blessed Mother from her affectionate children, which is every day coming into more general use. Other devotions we could name, which evince a growing love for the tenderer and more moving class of religious emotions." End quote. The Cardinal was referring to the natural resurgence among English Catholics of pious devotions which were once flourishing in the Middle Ages, but were virtually rooted out of public and private life in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation. It is ironic that members of the liturgical movement, in their desire to conciliate Protestant sensibilities, took steps to reverse the trend of devotionalism among Catholics, which had been encouraged by papal approval for the whole Church.
Yes, so the good bishops and cardinals praise these devotions. They're the bread and butter of the average faithful. And they're good, they're to be encouraged. Maybe when we get, God willing, a church built, we could have they have the racks of candles that go in front of statues, which are very beautiful. You saw them in Montreal in the churches. They just have to be ultra safe from catching fire, but with all precaution, it's a praiseworthy practice. A false dichotomy. There is no doubt that the 20th century liturgical reformers viewed their efforts in terms of a zero-sum game in which the winnings on their side must necessarily equal the losses on the side of traditional Catholics. Suddenly, devotions found themselves in competition with the liturgy, whereas before Baudouin's time, they had always been regarded as a means of supplementing the benefits of the liturgy by increasing the religious fervor of the faithful. So the Modernists saw the devotions as antagonistic, as opposed to the liturgy. While before, all the saints encourage them. But Baudouin's call for the, quote, sublimation of devotions, which means evaporate them, was a veiled invitation to discard them, leaving the official liturgy as the only option for the faithful. This is precisely what was understood by his followers in the liturgical movement, as is clear from statements made by some of its leading lights. Let us just take a few examples. Father William Bush, a co-worker of Dom Virgil Michel at St. John's Abbey in Minnesota, appointed by Michel to the editorial board of the first edition of Orate Fratres in 1926, complained in a letter to the editor of Commonweal magazine in 1925, so this is exactly 100 years ago. Quote, Michael,
Undoubtedly, there is something amiss in the present quality of Catholic spirituality. Our devotional life, and hence our whole mentality as Catholics, is individualistic. And the chief reason for this is to be found in an examination of our prayer books. The individualistic character of modern prayer literature cannot fail to impress itself on our life and dim our social vision. But the official prayer of the Church, which we do not use, or which we use so privately and mechanically, so as not to count, are filled through and through with that very spirit of which you are justly pleading. We have lost that sense of Christian neighborliness and of the kingdom of God on earth, which the liturgy teaches, end quote.
So that's Father Bush. All right, so go on.
If we think about this for a moment, without the anti-traditional bias, it becomes clear that another reason, in addition to ecumenism, for the rejection of devotions was that they could not be used for what Dom Michel called social regeneration, which for the former liturgists corresponded with extreme left-wing ideas of social justice. When Father Hans Reinhold, and a proponent of these views, visited St. John's Abbey in 1938, the year of Father Michel's death, he found that already, quote, the monks shared my liberal economic and political views, end quote. And he confirmed that, quote, we were all of one mind on liturgical reform, end quote. Politics then, for the reformers, fitted into liturgy like a hand in a glove.
Liberal politics, liberal liturgy. So ecumenism, social regeneration, community was the focus. And private devotions, which the faithful are free to do, were scorned and even mocked. Go on.
Regarding devotions, the French Oratorian, Father Louis Boyer,
our old friend here, well, old enemy, Father Louis Boyer,
commented in 1955, the very year when the Holy Week reforms were signed into law by the decree Maxima Redemptionis, quote, it is when the people are no longer in touch with the authentic spirit of the liturgy that such devotions are developed. You cannot at the same time hail Christ as if he were a little baby in his cradle and adore him as the risen Lord. You cannot weep for his passion as if you did not know that it has already ended in victory, and also exult in the resurrection. You cannot combine a mysticism centered on Jesus as the prisoner of the tabernacle with celebrating the Eucharist as the saving mystery. The more you are attached to one set of these alternatives, the more you must accept the loss of the other. You cannot eat your cake and treasure it for tomorrow. You must choose. We cannot hope to return to a living liturgy while we concentrate on these devotions and even add them, end quote.
And even add to them. So that's Louis Boyer. Again, what's he saying in a nutshell, anybody?
He's saying that shouldn't have private devotions because it leads to a lack of understanding the liturgy, according to him.
He's also kind of focusing on like a purely resurrection-focused liturgy. He doesn't want to focus on the passion and Christ's suffering. He wants to focus on like basically the resurrection fist. Right?
Yeah, there's truth to that. Yes. So, I mean, it's partly true that we are, as St. Pius X said, to get the Catholic spirit, the best way is to pray the prayers of the Church, the breviary, the Mass, especially for priests and seminarians and monks. That's their life. But the pious devotions of the faithful are not to be scorned. There's some account about St. John Bosco, because some clergy will make fun of the pious old ladies that are always in church praying and lighting candles and praying the rosary, and some clergy look down on them, as we call them rink rats in the arenas. They're like church mice. And St. John Bosco, he defended them and said, you kind of make fun of these pious ladies, but they're the hidden backbone of the church. Their prayers, they pray for the parish, they pray for the vocations, their prayers hold up many pillars that would otherwise fall. So he defended them. And I think if ever you're priests, you have to always encourage that. The pious old ladies are sometimes very precious in God's eyes. Some of them surpass in sanctity perhaps many priests, monks, and nuns even. Yes, Michael?
I forgot who said it, but is it also because when you have private devotion versus, like, say you have somebody who's going to Mass every Sunday, let's say to do the dialogue Mass, it's a mechanical thing and it's like a community event, but when you have private devotions, you have like a spiritual life, how would you say, it's kind of separate from a community event. You're kind of, what's the word, you're
Well, his word is individualistic.
yeah.
Well, something that I see is, especially with Novus Ordo, is that it kind of nourishes a sense of being a Sunday Catholic. That you're kind of just Catholic on Sundays, and it doesn't really give you any drive to practice virtue throughout the week. So if you get rid of private devotions, it kind of gets rid of the spiritual life when you're outside of Mass. Because in the Novus Ordo, it's kind of just you go to Mass on Sunday, and that's it.
Yeah.
So it seems like it kind of like this type of thinking leads to that. If you get rid of all the other devotions outside of the Mass,
Your spiritual life is purely a community thing.
yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So, yes. So the private devotions are not to be scorned. They're not to be scorned. But you hear me say it often. For seminarians, if the seminarians are in Mass, are not using the Missal, and they're doing their private devotions, that's how would you word it? It's not, if one is going to be a priest, they have to really know the mind of the Church. When Father John of the Cross went to Archbishop Lefebvre in the seminary, he told me this. He said, I asked Archbishop Lefebvre, what's the best devotion that I could practice? And Archbishop Lefebvre took the breviary and the Roman Missal. He says, this is devotion of the Church. Be rooted in this devotion. So, and especially, he's a Benedictine, so they live the divine office every day. Every day. The day, 3:30 in the morning, matins, followed by lauds. 6:30 in the morning, prime, followed by chapter and the reading of the rule, then breakfast. And then 9:15 in the morning, terce, followed by the High Mass. And then 12:15, sextus, midday office. 2:00 or 2:15 is known, and then Vespers at 5:30, Compline at 8:30. 8 or 8:30 in the monastery. Then you go to bed and then rise at 3. That's the structure of the day. Everything centers around the divine office. So that's why it is one of the big penances of religious life in the monastery is, you got a project. You are, you just got cut one more piece of wood to fit whatever you're fixing. And you're about ready to cut, and then ding, 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 the bell rings for noon or for Vespers. And then you gotta stop. For a man, that's quite frustrating, because men like to finish their projects, right? Get them done. But that's one of the crosses of monastery life. You're almost finished, and then ding, 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 the divine office. So Don Marmion will call the bell the voice of God. And that's how we should see the bell as the voice of God, which is always on time and prompt and never late. So, all right. The influential Dominican theologian, Father Yves Congar. Ooh. He's mentioned quite often, and they haven't crowned him by Archbishop Lafayette. He's one of the big modernists. Father Yves Congar, a Dominican, stated with reference to the liturgy and popular devotions, quote, "Surely we must choose one or the other." On the first session of the Second Vatican Council, his report from Rome, 1963. And a historian of the Roman Rite summed up the general feeling of reformers. Quote, "We must deplore the success of devotions because they invade the whole of Catholic consciousness at the expense of the liturgy." That's Marcel Metzger, History of the Liturgy, the Major Stages. The same author states, quote, "Vatican II has restored the teaching of the liturgy and the formation of the clergy. We must recognize that this teaching was not given in a satisfactory way prior to the council." The way of the Traffids. On the theme of invasion, Father Joseph Jungmann, one of the consultors to Pius XII's liturgical commission, was comprehensive in his condemnation of devotions. He stated that, quote, "the entire wild growth of very peripheral forms of devotion was as welcome in the church as
Weeds.
weeds in a well-tended garden." Nobody wants weeds in their garden, so he's comparing devotion to the Sacred Heart, to the Immaculate Heart, devotion to the saints, as weeds. Rosary, as weeds. That's Father Jungmann. Devotions were thus depicted as a feral population of sinister weeds. The word triffids comes to mind. Advancing on the liturgy, must be some British word, with malevolent intent. This was one example of the sort of irrational prejudice on which the liturgical movement thrived. Anthony, go on.
As calumnies against traditional piety flew thick and fast, popular devotions came to be viewed as pestilential, as if they were a swarm of locusts or some sort of disease to be controlled or eradicated. And so they were persecuted by the liturgical establishment, almost to vanishing point. As a result, the only place where toleration for popular devotions was envisaged was in the home, at meetings, in national or local festivals, and in some religious societies. In fact, anywhere except in church. The history of the liturgical movement has shown that any attempt to systematically root out popular devotions destroys not only those forms of piety, but piety itself. Wherever deeply ingrained Catholic traditions, whether liturgical or not, have been rooted out, the void is invariably filled with activities of a secular nature, from which a sense of holy reverence is necessarily absent. The truth of this observation has been demonstrated on a massive worldwide scale in the liturgies of the Novus Ordo.
Yeah, can you attest to that?
Yeah.
It's true.
It's it's very communist. It's a very communist thing to just get rid of the individual. They're basically just trying to get rid of the individual and just focus on like the collective. That's basically what it is.
Repeat what you just said.
I said it's a very communist idea. They're trying to undermine the idea of the individual and kind of push this whole idea of, the whole.
The state,
The mass.
the common good,
Yeah.
which is fulfilling what Our Lady said. Communism will spread throughout the world, the errors of Russia, in the liturgy as well. And people think it's only political, but the new Mass was one of the communist effects, definitely. And this liturgical movement prepared it, which is why it's so important to study it. Agitorium nostrum in nomine Domini.